We have Gail and Angelica from PCAF over here to provide us an introductory session on carbon accounting, which will then lead to our portfolio-implied temperatures module and the work we'll be doing there. So Gail and Angelica, you can start whenever you're ready. And you can introduce yourselves in greater detail.
Yes, Heen, this is Giel Lindhorst. I'm happy to start this presentation with introducing myself. My name is Giel Lindhorst. I'm Executive Director of the PCAF Secretariat, and happy to present the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, PCAF, to you. And we like to have a very open discussion with you on PCAF. I know that many of you are part of PCAF and have been committed to measure and disclose finance emissions. So in this call, we also like to hear from you how you have been implementing the PCAF standard and share that experience with the others. For those that are not familiar with PCAF, myself and Angelica will present the initiative to you and present also the standard to you. So happy to have your questions after our introduction. Next slide, please. So PCAF is an industry-led initiative. It started in the Netherlands in 2015, led by ASN Bank at that time, but in 2015 already a group of about 12 financial institutions came together. It was a group of banks, asset owners, asset managers, even an insurance company was part at the beginning when PCAF was founded. And they started PCAF because they noticed that all the financial institutions in the Netherlands were in some form measuring the climate-related impact of their loans and investments, but were using different type of methods, different type of metrics, and it was not transparent. So they decided, let's create a bottom-up initiative of a group of financial institutions that wants to harmonize the way they measure their emissions related to their loans and investments. So they started with this initial group of about 12 financial institutions. Then it was picked up in 2018 by Amalgamated Bank, who brought it to North America. Also a group of mainly banks at that time and credit unions worked together to bring the Dutch work to the North American context. But in beginning of 2019, a group of leading financial institutions stood up and started the process of globalizing PCAF. And this process, this plan was funded by philanthropies, and the scale up into the global PCAF was launched in September 2019. Currently, PCAF is led by these 8 organizations that form the steering committee. So it's ABN AMRO, Amalgamated Bank, ASM Bank, the Global Alliance on Banking on Values, which is a group or a network organization of about 60 value-based banks, Morgan Stanley, NMB Bank, that's a bank in Nepal, Creators Bank, and the UN Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. We partnered with the UN convened Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. They are part of the steering committee to also represent the asset owners, the investors community. And Nordea Life and Pension is part of the steering committee as representative of the UN convened Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. This group leads the initiative, and the initiative has mainly 2 objectives. One is to globalize and standardize the measurement of finance emissions, and that's why also the group developed the global greenhouse gas accounting and reporting standard for the financial sector, and that was launched last year in November. And we will also, of course, in this presentation, highlight the standard and the accounting rules in the standard. But next to creating the standard, also the goal of the initiative is to increase the number of financial institutions that use the standard and measure and disclose finance emissions. And currently we are at almost 130 financial institutions in 40 countries with over 40 trillion in US dollars in assets. We have grown tremendously over the last months and are still very much growing, because many financial institutions recognize that this is really key for assessing risks, but also for aligning their portfolio with the Paris Agreement. So measuring finance emissions helps them to meet such goals. Next slide. Well, at the start of the global initiative, already a group was formed to develop the first ever global standard. That was at that time a group of 16 financial institutions out of the total that joined forces to develop the standard, building on the work done in the Netherlands and North America. So over a period of almost a year, they developed the global greenhouse gas accounting and reporting standard, which was launched in November last year. And the standard was also reviewed by well, a lot of stakeholders that commented through on the standard during the public consultation process. But also, and more importantly, you could say the standard was also reviewed, officially reviewed by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, by World Resources Institute. And they approved the standard to be in conformance with the requirements set forth in their greenhouse gas protocol, corporate value chain scope 3 accounting and reporting standard. So, and that stamp, the built on greenhouse gas protocol stamp, is very important and has been given to the standard as well. Next slide. So what's on this in the standard? Which asset classes are covered? So the group that developed the standard had an initial discussion on the scope of the standard. And based on the work done in the Netherlands and the work done in North America, the group decided to start the work of the global standard on these 6 asset classes. And these were selected because, well, there were already robust methods for these asset classes, but these asset classes were already tested to a lot of assets within financial institutions. So I think over 1 trillion of assets were already measured with related to emissions by the work done already. So that's why the group decided to focus on these 6 asset classes: listed equity and corporate bonds, business loans and unlisted equity, that's equity to private companies, you could say. Project finance, that's project finance to any type of project, you could say, that can use the same accounting rules. Commercial real estate, mortgages, and motor vehicle loans. So with these 6 asset classes, also a large part of the portfolio of many financial institutions is covered. And that's, I think, also important, that the standard covers a large part of your portfolio. In the standard, you will find the detailed accounting rules, how to measure emissions. We will add in the new version of the standard, the updated version, you could say, also case studies. So there will be clear examples in the new version. And the new version that we'll publish also at the climate conference this year will also have a few additional asset classes. So the work of the core team didn't stop with the publication of this standard. We will continue, and the group actually expanded to now 20 financial institutions that work on additional asset classes like sovereign bonds, green bonds, but will also add emission removals, so more guidance on how to measure and and well, disclose the emissions related or the investments related to emission removals. And that can come through investments into companies that have emission removals, or in projects that lead to emission removals. And that's important to many of the financial institutions part of PCAF, because many of them have been setting goals or have net zero goals. And as part of net zero goals, these financial institutions also want to measure and disclose on emission removals in their portfolio. So at the upcoming climate conference in November this year, we will publish an extended version of the standard. Next slide. My colleague Angelica will dive into the accounting rules in the standard in the second part of this presentation. But first of all, I'd like to highlight why this standard is so relevant and why we have seen a tremendous growth of financial institutions committing to PCAF. So we see that this growth is mainly due to the fact that measuring finance emissions helps you to meet several of your business goals. So, for instance, on creating transparency for stakeholders and reporting to, for instance, platforms like CDP is really important to measure finance emissions. CDP has updated its financial service questionnaire, including questions regarding your Scope 3 finance emissions. And by answering those questions, you get additional scoring points on the CDP disclosure, which lead to your A rating in that disclosure. Related to risks, we'll highlight that as well. But the TCFD just came out with a proposed set of metrics for TCFD disclosure for financial institutions, and has decided to incorporate PCAF's global greenhouse gas accounting and reporting standard into the recommended metrics. We see also that many financial institutions are developing new types of products and services, and also to measure the impact and the positive impact of those products, you need clear accounting rules. And also PCAF is helping there to develop clear accounting rules for products like investing in renewable energy, green bonds, but also, for instance, energy efficiency loans or so. So also to show the positive impacts of those products, there are accounting rules already available or will be developed in the coming year. Finally, to align with the Paris Agreement and to set targets, PCAF helps you to set a baseline, to assess your emissions and set a baseline, to set also goals. And we have been collaborating with the Science Based Targets initiative over the past years to embed measuring finance emissions into the Science Based Targets initiative. And if you look at the current guidance from the Science Based Targets initiative, you will see that it clearly refers to PCAF as well. Next slide. Just a few words on the TCFD. We're really excited that the TCFD has decided also to recommend PCAF. When the TCFD came out a couple of years ago, it already had metrics and targets as one of the pillars, also for financial institutions. But they had limited guidance on how to measure and how to disclose for those metrics. And that's, I think, where they see a lot of value in PCAF, is because PCAF defines clear accounting rules per asset class. And also with PCAF, you can also get to an aggregated metric at a portfolio level for your whole portfolio. If it's a mortgage, or if it's a real estate, or if it's a business loan, then you can use the same metric. And that was for some metrics that the TCFD recommended, like the weighted average carbon intensity, not the case because that only works for corporate instruments and not for mortgages and less for real estate. So that's why the TCFD has incorporated PCAF. On the next slide, you will see the two reports that came out that are currently under public consultation till the 7th of July. But in that report, in the proposed guidance on climate metrics, they clearly have recommended PCAF to measure and disclose emissions in line with PCAF's global greenhouse gas accounting and reporting standard. They still have also the weighted average carbon intensity there, and that's mainly due to the fact that currently we don't have a method, accounting methods for insurance, for insurance underwriting. And we plan to develop that as well. But especially for insurance companies, they still also have the WACC as a metric there. And they have also then expanded that to others that have been using the WACC, as that was the main recommended metric in the first publication of the TCFD. So, but you see that that PCAF is at the heart of this report as a key initiative for financial institutions to measure and disclose their financed emissions. Next slide. Then I'd like to hand over to my colleague Angelica to tell you more about the details of the standard, but also how it's been implemented. Over to you, Angelica.
Thank you, Gio. Thanks for giving the overall introduction. And before I run into the nitty-gritty of the standard, I want to just ask the audience if there are any questions on the content that he'll just share with you. Okay, if there are no questions at the moment, I'll continue. Feel free to put your questions on the chat, or even if you want to interrupt me when I am speaking, also raise your hand or unmute yourself. This is supposed to be also an interactive session. And for all of you that are new to this, we are hoping to also get all the questions for clarification, and for those of you who have already applied the standard, also to pitch in with your experience, so that it could also be a peer-to-peer learning experience today. So I would like to start first by telling you that once the PCAF standard was published, or while the PCAF standard was on the making, the PCAF Global was working also at the regional level in 5 regions of the world: Europe, North America, Latin America, Asia Pacific, and Africa. And as they were already up and running and the standard was published, then it came to be that this year, 2021, was named as the year of the PCAF standard implementation. So the focus of these groups this year is to really work together into finding ways to solve certain issues that can be found at the regional or local level in terms of the implementation of the carbon accounting rules. Most of the times, the main issues that are faced by you as financial institutions when it comes to implementing the standard, it's the data challenge. And these data challenges are very localized. It depends on the context. It depends on sometimes even the country where you are located, not necessarily the region. So these teams are supposed to be a forum for you when you become a PCAF participant to share with your peers about your experience, your challenges, and then learn from the financial institutions that are more advanced and that have overcome some of the roadblocks in their way. Some of the blocks here you see that are in pink. This means that there are some possibilities to also create PCAF chapters, national chapters in those countries. The blue ones are already established and they are running as we speak. Now, here in this deck, you see this is a link to download the standard. In case you haven't visited the PCAF website, you can just click this link and get the document to start applying the standard. And what is important for this part of the presentation is to try to explain to you how the carbon accounting rule works for each of the asset classes that are currently in the standard. So the general approach basically means that when you do annual accounting of your finance emissions, it means that you will measure the emissions that are associated with your loans and investments at a fixed point in time, which is in line with your financial disclosures. So ideally, once you as a financial institution present your annual reports with your financial accounts, with your balance sheet, you would also present what are the emissions that are financed through those financial accounts. And that's what fixed point in time means, in line with the financial disclosures. Now let's turn to the main equation that here's on the center. This is the general approach to calculate and finance emissions, and this equation has two parts. The first part, let's focus on the right-hand side, which is the greenhouse gas emissions of your client if you are a bank, or in that case will be the borrower, or the investee if you are an investor. So let's say, for example, that you as a bank give a loan to a cement company. So these greenhouse gas emissions would be the emissions, the absolute emissions that are coming scope 1 and 2 from that cement company. If you are given a mortgage or you are lending to buy a real estate, then the emissions would be of a building. So that's what greenhouse gas emissions means in this equation, the absolute total, the scope 1 and 2 emissions of your client or of your investee. Then on the left-hand side of the equation is the attribution factor. And that basically means or indicates what is your indirect responsibility of the greenhouse gas emissions that you are financing. And this attribution factor is a rate of those emissions, and it is equivalent to the outstanding loan or investment amount that is in your balance sheet for this client or your investee over the equity plus debt, or the value of the company, in this case, if it's a company, or the value of the property at loan origination. And we will see these different nuances depending on the asset class. But for now, this general equation basically gives you an idea that there is an attribution factor that you will need to use in order to identify what are the emissions that you are indirectly responsible for in the real economy as you have financed some of these activities, economic activities of your companies or of your clients or investees. So let's go to each of the asset classes. So there are two slides. This first, each of the slides is going to show you 3 asset classes. And what is interesting about these 2 slides that I'm going to show is basically the nuances or specific accounting rules for each asset class. So it's starting with the listed equity and corporate bonds. If you go back here to this equation, what we are going to see the differences is basically on the denominator of this equation. The rest of the equation, it's the same. For listed equity and corporate bonds, we use IVIC as the denominator for listed companies. And then if you are lending to a private company, then you still will use book value, so equity plus debt. There is also an important remark in the standard about scope 3 emissions, because you have heard me saying scope 1 and scope 2 emissions of the company or of their clients or investees. But for this listed equity and corporate bonds plus business loans and unlisted equity, there is a rule for phasing in scope 3 emissions as well of your clients and investees. And this is phasing a scope of 3 emissions. It starts with high emitting sectors like coal, oil, and gas. And it starts next year. So the moment you start to report in 2022, you're reporting financial year of 2021. So that means that next year, when you present your disclosures, you will be required also to present disclosure on scope 3 of the clients and investees that are in the oil, gas, and mining sector. And the standard gives you a table with this phasing approach. So year on year, additional sectors will be added for the requirements. On project finance, yeah, there is a question.
Yes, Angelica, hi, this is Anna from UBS. I wanted to ask your view on the double counting question. So regarding banks' activities, either on the investment or lending side, so what is your view on the double counting of the emissions problem? So basically, if you're calculating the same emissions several times because of the scope 3 of a client, so yeah, they might have the same emissions in their value chain as some other companies already do.
Yeah, absolutely. So how the standard treats the scope 3 emissions is aligned with the greenhouse gas protocol. And that basically means that the scope 3 emissions are reported separately. So you will not add scope 3 to your scope 1 and 2. You will report scope 1 and 2 in one bucket, or if you want to also separate scope 1 and scope 2, that is up to your financial institution. But it's required that scope 3 is disclosed separately. So that is to avoid this at a minimal this double counting there. And obviously, the double counting in general is it's minimized by having this accounting rule here, the attribution. Yeah, and I'll explain just in a moment. But that doesn't mean that that double counting will be avoided 100%. And that is exactly the same for the corporate greenhouse gas accounted. So for companies that are also measuring and reporting emissions using the greenhouse gas protocol is the same issue. So it's an issue that it's recognized by the greenhouse gas protocol, that is minimized by the attribution, but it's not avoided 100%. And just
Thank you.
Okay, Anna, thank you. Anybody else would like to make a question?
It's Holly Henningwood from RBC. This is a little bit off from where you are in your presentation, but I'm wondering about the data provided by PCAF in relation to emissions for the different asset classes. I understand there's no plan right now to update the data. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that issue.
You mean update which data?
I believe it's the emissions data.
So are you referring to the PCAF emissions database, or are you referring to your data, like the one that you collect to do the measurement?
The PCAF emissions database.
Okay, got it. So let me jump a little bit to that slide. So there is for those of you who don't know, there is an emissions factor database that was developed by PCAF last year as in parallel to the development of the standard. And this emissions factor database has more than 3 million emission factors across regions, across asset classes, and across different sectors. And this is a collection of public available data. So you could actually find this data all over the place, online or in research and databases, etc. But what PCAF did was to make an effort to take all of these public sources and put it in one-stop shop, so that it would be available for all of you who are PCAF participants, that the effort will be minimized in the search of those average emission factors, and that you will also be able to start as soon as possible in the measurement. Despite that, the emissions factor database also does not provide actual emissions of your companies. It provides average emission factors for the sectors at country, regional level. So to your question on Holly, on updates, the PCAF Secretariat does update the database as long as the public sources that we are taking the information from is updated. So what we do is monitor those public sources, and as soon as we know or we are told that the public source is updated, then this update comes into the database. Second thing is that as more PCAF participants start to measure emissions, the process would lead them to also find emissions data at the country level. Yeah, and that might be even better data than the average data that you will find in a public source. Maybe it's a statistical data of your country or the country where your bank is operating. And if that is the case, you can also contact the PCAF Secretariat, and we can run a quality assessment of those emission factors. And if they are robust, then they are added to the database. And that means that you are helping feed up the database, make it also available for other institutions that are operating in the region where you are also operating. Does that answer your question, Holly?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
I saw a comment in the chat on the database, so let's respond to that right away. It's about scope 3 emissions in the database. Well, this database is for corporate emissions related to business loans and listed equity, and so we use data from an input-output model to come to sector average emission intensity on a very low level, disaggregated sector, and on a country level. So, for instance, rice in a certain country, even if you have a rice farmer in your portfolio, that's kind of a very low level as an example. But we have this level in the database, and also because it's input-output modeling, we have also upstream emissions related to these sectors in the database. So when you download the data for emissions related to a certain sector, you get also the upstream scope 3 emissions with that. So we have numbers for that. We don't have the downstream emissions. So for oil and gas, and for instance for sectors like automotive, you have to model it in a different way. You don't get it directly from the database, but we have, on the other hand, emission factors for emissions related to oil production, or to so there are also physical emission intensities in the database that can be used to model those downstream emissions. So yeah, just to share that also scope 3 to some extent are in the database. And just to clarify, this database once more is really meant for screening. So with this database, you can really quickly assess over your whole portfolio where the emissions are. We call that a hotspot analysis. So you can quickly hotspot where the emissions are in your portfolio. And that's needed also for the second steps in data quality improvement. So often financial institutions combine or start with the database, then they combine that with data from other sources, and that can be also the sources that they already have, like through data vendors like Bloomberg, MSCI, or other data providers. And if you combine that, then you get to a really good first estimate of the emissions related to your portfolio. Over to you, Angelica.
Thanks, Jill. Thank you. Okay, so let's go back then to the asset classes. So we were here in project finance. So basically here in the project finance, the attribution is also based on project value. So we are talking about the money that is financing a project specifically. So you know exactly what is the finance used for. And so therefore, the denominator is the total equity and debt of that project. And the emissions that are used to be attributed to you is scope 1 and 2. And if scope 3 is relevant and available to be calculated, then as also you can also include it. And avoided emissions are covered as well. Important to note is that the emissions accounting is also in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol on project accounting of the IFIR harmonization project. This is for international financial institutions or development banks. And on top of that, the lifetime emissions of the project are included when the financing is going to a project that is, or that you are the initial sponsor or you're the initial lender of that project. That's the only time when you as a financial institution takes responsibility of scope 1 and 2 lifetime emissions. Now for commercial real estate and mortgages, it's pretty similar or basically the same attribution. Here we're talking about the denominator that looks into the value of the property at time of loan origination. And the scope 1 and 2 emissions of each building at the operational phase, of course. And the scope 3 emissions of the building or embodied emissions are not incorporated in the standard yet, but are voluntary. And this includes basically the construction phase. That is only if, say, for example, the project developer is reporting or disclosing their emissions, then we encourage, or the PCAF standard encourages the financial institution to also report separately those scope 3 emissions if available. And lastly, for the motor vehicle loans, it's very similar to mortgages. The attribution is based on the total value at origination, so the value of the vehicle when the loan was granted, and again the annual scope 1 and 2 emissions of the vehicle or vehicle fleet that you are financing. Specific account rules for the asset classes, but bear in mind that the main approach or the main general equation, it's one approach, it's attribution times the total absolute emissions of your investee or borrower. So therefore, finance emissions gives you a metric in absolute emissions, so kilograms, tons, CO2 total. And that with that metric, you can, depending on what your goal is to use those finance emissions for, you can also sort of normalize that absolute metric into intensity metrics. Say, for example, if you want to set science-based targets using the sectoral decarbonization approach, then you will use absolute emissions and divide it by the attributed activity as well. And then you will get an intensity in activity data that will help you initiate the process of modeling your science-based targets. Then we come back to the data. The standard has a data quality scoring card that goes from 1 to 5. Score 1 is the one that has less error for in the estimations, because basically means that you are using the reporting emissions of, the reported emissions of your client or of your investee. So let's go back to the example of the cement company. Your bank is lending to a cement company, and it happens, lucky you, that the cement company is reporting their emissions in the CDP disclosure project, or they report the emissions in their annual sustainability report. So then you can easily take those numbers and then plug it in the general equation, and then you have the finance emissions. That's the easiest way to get to the finance emissions, but the most challenging one in terms of data, because as we know, a lot or most of the corporations do not yet report their own emissions. So that's score number 1. Now the scores go from 2 to 5, and that basically means estimations based on activity data of your clients or economic activity data. And there are more nitty-gritty behind those scores that we don't have time to go into that level of detail. But what I want you to take away from this slide is that the scoring is not meant to penalize the financial institution. A score 5 doesn't mean that you have a bad result. It means that you can take that information in order to be able to see and to plug it, say, look at the right hand side of the slide, to look into where of those emissions and what score it is represented, yeah, what it's equivalent to, and then kind of zeroing on the sectors and even clients that you will need to be focusing on in order to increase the data quality in the medium or long term. So it basically it's an instrument rather than a finger pointing device. It's an instrument for you to get more clarity, more transparency on where do you need to put your effort in order to increase that data quality. So just to give you an example, if you do a snapshot analysis of your greenhouse gas accounting without going into a high level detail, and then you come into these results where you have a score 5 with a sector with the highest emissions, then you will say, okay, out of all of these sectors, my highest emission is here, even though the error margin is high. But that means that I should maybe start to look into more detail here to see how can I get more accurate data, more accurate results, and then move that data quality score to the left and maybe get into that level of, okay, what do I need to do in order to engage with that client and to bring down those emissions to support the decarbonization of that client. I saw a question coming in the chat, but I cannot open up the chat. I don't know why. Maybe here, can you help me?
I don't see it either. So Maheen.
I can say the question out loud. That's probably
Yeah,
easier when to
please.
interrupt you. Your comment that you're lucky if a cement company discloses their emissions actually triggered a question in terms of how far away are we from a requirement for a cement company in your example, or the equivalent, to have to disclose their emissions, or for banks to be required to only finance projects where the emissions are known? Because that would actually, it shouldn't be a luck question, say.
Yeah, no. Well, so there is no requirement yet, and I don't know. Maybe Hill, you can help me complement my answer, but I would imagine that this is more. I would look into more a systematic approach. So if we take a step back, I mean, what are we trying to solve here? It's not just measuring, right? You as a financial institution want to be part of the bigger picture, which is the decarbonization of the economy, right? And when you look into the finance emissions, you are looking into a little piece of the puzzle, which is basically what is your indirect responsibility in those emissions that are in the economy, those emissions that are going to the atmosphere, basically, right? So if you think about, okay, if I am financing this cement and this cement client, and this cement client is not reporting their emissions, and there is no requirement for this client to report emissions, so how do we do this? How do we move forward? So one thing that I usually convey in this context is that it's about engagement. So you as a financial institution have a strong leverage with your clients to work together, not to scare them off, because you don't want to lose your clients, right? You want to work with them through this decarbonization pathway and finding together solutions in order to help the client, in this case, the cement company, to either push them a bit to the path of reporting, so that you want to know, you're financing this client, you want to know how their emissions profile is. It's in your interest, and you can walk them through that process. And secondly, the moment you have those actual emissions, it's easier for you to also do this measurement, but not just the measurement, but then also come up with the strategies in your own institution for this decarbonization. If you are talking about net zero, for example, then what is it that you're going to do to get there? And it's not just slashing out the carbon from your portfolio like divestment only, but also thinking along with your clients on what can be done, what products can you offer. So yeah, it's an opportunity as well for you to develop banking products that would bring business to your bank, but also help the client to decarbonize. Does that answer your question, Ludina?
Yeah, very clearly, actually, thanks. Because basically this, yeah, yes.
Okay, good. But no, feel free to comment as well. That's the purpose of the discussion.
Thanks.
I see some other, I can access the chat now, Angelica. I see some other questions, but maybe it's good to answer them all at once at the end. It's a variety of questions, but I suggest that we use like 5 minutes more to wrap up the presentation and then go to.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide because we already talked about this. Maybe the last thing I will say is that this emissions factor database is available for all PCAF participants. So that's if you, after this presentation, decide to also join PCAF, please feel free to contact Hill or myself. We can go into more level of detail with you to explain what does it mean to join PCAF. But you will immediately get access, free access to the database as soon as you join. And the last part that I want to show you are just some examples of how some PCAF participants are disclosing their finance emissions. So here it's Triodos Bank, a long-standing bank in PCAF, one of the founder members. And on the left-hand side, you see top, the absolute emissions, which is the requirement of the standard. At the bottom, one of the normalizations that Triodos Bank does, and that is in terms of the billion, the euros financed or invested. And on the right-hand side, what you see is a very nice table where you basically can look into the total outstanding loans and investments that Triodos has on the first column, and then next to it, what is the associated emissions, which is with each of the line items of those sectors. Also, the emission intensity in Eurofinance, and on top of that, the data quality score of each of these sectors. So this is the result of looking into the data quality scorecard that I just explained. So depending on what data Triodos has used, then they come to a score that is also based on an equation that is in the standard, clear defined on how you would calculate your score. The second example, it's recent as well from NatWest Group. It's very similar to the one I just showed. Here are the sectors: residential mortgages, agriculture, automotive, oil and gas extraction. So here's one example of a scope 3 already for oil and gas, which is the requirement within the PCAF standard. And again, you have the finance emissions in absolute megatons of CO2 in the year, associated scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 separate. The physical emissions intensity, economic emissions intensity. And then you have the data quality scorecard as well. And then the last one, which is, I wanted to bring this up because this is an investor. The last two were banks only, but this is an investor as well that is showing the scope 1, 2, and 3, upstream, downstream, in the 3 different funds that they have in their portfolio. And they have the total finance emissions per fund plus the intensity per investments. So that's also an interesting report that I invite you to check out. All of the PCAF participants that have already disclosed emissions are about 34. So it's about 35% if you have a cut at the end of last year, because we receive new participants into the initiative about 3 to 4 per week. So it would be unfair to say 34 over the 128 institutions that we have at the moment. But this 35% is a cut by the end of last year. So it is growing. We did a brief survey this year to kind of assess when the current PCAF participants start to disclose, and we expect, but by the end of this year, around in the two-digit number more will be disclosed. And so that's it's a very gratifying news because it means that the institutions really are working hard towards implementing the standard and disclosing what they can, right? It's not that they disclose the 100% of the portfolios right away, but they just start with a scope that is manageable, depending of the size of their teams, the resources, and also with the support of the PCAF Secretariat. So with that, I will basically invite you to join the initiative. For those of you who have not joined, please come join the group of 128. And now let's open up for questions, more questions and discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, so Angelica, I suggest we start with some questions in the chat. First of all, one thing that we didn't mention is that it's free to join for you. So this initiative is funded through philanthropies that fund the globalization of PCAF, and in that sense, it's free for you to join, for any financial institution to join. You even get some free support from the Secretariat. And of course, you get access to the PCAF database as well. And to that notice, I think it's also in that sense interesting to see the first question in the chat, which was related to the overlap between the PCAF and the TCFD. So how we see it and how the TCFD is currently also recommending to use PCAF is if you implement PCAF and start measuring and reporting on those emissions, on your finance emissions, you then also comply with the TCFD. So you don't need to publish a separate report for your TCFD, but you already have the metric in place to also report on the TCFD. And the same, the NatWest example that is in the slides is also the NatWest reporting on their climate-related disclosure. So this is their TCFD report, which has the finance emissions as their metric. And this example also shows clearly the scope 3. There are some questions in the chat on scope 3 and also on down and upstream. Well, you need to disclose in the end all emissions, so both upstream and downstream of your clients. And we have this phase-in approach according to also the European taxonomy and the European benchmark regulation to phase in sectors, as explained by Angelica, in the reporting, and that of course is required for both upstream and downstream. But yeah, as most of you know, for an oil and gas company, it's of course the downstream emissions that matter. So in that case, yeah, you can focus from a materiality point of view on the downstream emissions of oil and gas. And the same holds for other sectors as well. But in essence, you have to disclose both upstream and downstream scope 3 attributed to your investment. But there's also a question on the data quality and data availability. So we believe that there is already sufficient data out there, publicly available, that enables you to start with measuring finance emissions. And I always also take the parallel between a financial institution and a large corporate. Take, for instance, Unilever. Unilever has a huge supply chain with millions of, in the end, also farmers deep down in their supply chain. And they also measure and report on the emissions of their full supply chain. And they do also the modeling based for that on sector averages. And they also set a target on their supply chain emissions. So in that sense, financial institution with millions of clients, from an accounting point of view, greenhouse gas accounting point of view, is not fully different than a Unilever, which has to model all the emissions in their supply chain. And also setting targets. Of course, you could argue, well, if you have data quality 5 and you want to set a target, then of course, when data improves over time, does the target still hold? That is a question that probably can be answered over time and could require a recalculation of your baseline emissions. But I think in most cases, you could still go with a target, because if you have a huge portfolio in a certain sector, then probably your portfolio average is close to the sector average. And if you have a mortgage portfolio in a specific country and you have a huge portfolio, then your portfolio is quite close to the sector average in emission intensity. So setting a target would still hold if you are if your portfolio reflects the sector. Those were, I think, the main questions in the chat. Any final questions from the audience? We have still 1 minute. Any questions?
In the meantime, it'd be great if you could share your email addresses in the chat in case anyone wants to contact you directly.
Yeah. That's fine. Any other questions? If not, over to you, Maheen. Or is it that you have an
additional question? Yeah.
To have a consultant to implement? Yeah, so what we think is that in the end, financial institutions can do this themselves. It might be that in the beginning you need some help. And maybe also you want to source data from one of the data vendors. And we know that many of the data vendors have also translated their data into PCAF compliant data sets, you could say. But most of them can help you, but also some consultants can help. But I think, well, some like the ones that were presented have been limited, been using consultants, because I think this type of measurement can easily be implemented by a financial institution itself. And that's also what we try to enable with this initiative, that we give also trainings to financial institutions to do these type of calculations themselves. But if you need additional capacity, need resource, of course, there are multiple resource consultants that can help you.
Great. We are at the end of the hour, so I just want to say thank you, Gil and Angelica, for your presentation. I think you provided great insights into PCAF. And if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to contact us. Thank you, everyone, for joining today.
You're welcome. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.